You wake up feeling awful. Your throat is dry, your head is heavy, and even getting out of bed feels like a negotiation. So you stay under the blanket, reach for your phone, order something warm, and tell yourself you'll be fine tomorrow. You have options everywhere. A pharmacy is nearby. A doctor exists. Someone can bring you food. You can turn on the heater, close the curtains, and spend 3 days doing absolutely nothing while your body fights whatever went wrong. Now erase all of it. Your ancestors once got sick in a world where being unable to hunt wasn't an inconvenience. It could mean you couldn't eat, couldn't move, couldn't protect yourself, and couldn't keep warm. So, what happened when an ancient human got sick and simply couldn't hunt? And here's the part that changes the entire story. Your ancestors didn't survive because every person was strong enough to survive alone. They survived because very slowly and painfully humans became the kind of animal that could keep someone alive when that person couldn't contribute. And that strange ability may be one of the most important things your species ever evolved, because getting sick is easy. Surviving it is the difficult part. Imagine you're somewhere in East Africa around 1.7 million years ago. You wake up beside a small group of people, but something is wrong. Your muscles ache. You're cold even though the air isn't. You try to stand, take a few steps, and immediately realize that today, you're not hunting anything. That's the first problem. You need calories precisely when you are least capable of getting them. And your ancestors didn't have refrigerators full of food waiting for them. At sites such as Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, archaeologists have found stone tools and animal remains dating back roughly 1.8 million years, giving us a glimpse of a world where obtaining food required movement, effort, cooperation, and often dangerous encounters with animals. But here's what nobody tells you about prehistoric hunger. Hunting wasn't necessarily an individual job. The popular image is a lone prehistoric man chasing a mammoth with a spear. But human survival was usually much messier and more social than that. Different members of a group could gather plants, process food, watch children, maintain fires, carry resources, or stay with someone who was injured. You didn't necessarily need to kill an animal yourself to deserve a share of it. That distinction matters. Because if the group only fed whoever successfully hunted that day, one bad injury could immediately become a death sentence. And archaeology gives us clues that this wasn't always how humans operated. At Dmanisi in present-day Georgia, fossils dating to around 1.8 million years ago include an individual who had lost most of their teeth long before death. The jaw had undergone major bone remodeling, suggesting the person survived for a substantial period after losing the ability to chew normally. Think about that for a second. This wasn't someone who simply had a bad afternoon. This was a human relative who had suffered a serious physical limitation and somehow remained alive. Somebody had to make survival easier. Food may have been softened, processed, or otherwise made easier to consume. We can't watch what happened, so archaeology can't tell us exactly who helped or what they did every day. But the fossil tells us something extraordinary. Being vulnerable didn't automatically mean being abandoned, and that may be one of the oldest clues we have that human survival was becoming a group project. But sickness creates another problem. Food isn't the only thing you need. You need water, you need warmth, you need protection, and you need rest. Imagine being feverish while sleeping outdoors or inside a rough shelter, with no antibiotics, no thermometer, no clean hospital bed, and no certainty that you'll wake up feeling better. Your body is already fighting something. Now your environment starts fighting you too. This is where fire becomes more than something you cook dinner over. At archaeological sites such as Gesher Benot Yaakov in northern Israel, researchers have found evidence of controlled fire use dating to roughly 790,000 years ago, including burned plant and animal remains associated with human activity. Fire gave your ancestors something incredibly valuable: control. It could make food easier to chew. It could provide warmth. It could offer light. It could help create a safer place to rest. And, if you were sick, that mattered enormously. Because one of the simplest ancient treatments may not have been medicine at all, it was being allowed to stop. Modern life makes rest feel almost effortless. You lie down, you close your eyes, you don't have to worry that wolves are approaching your shelter, you don't have to decide whether leaving your bed means finding food or freezing outside. Your ancestors had no such guarantee. So if someone was sick, other people could become their protection. Someone gathered food, someone maintained the fire, someone watched the children, someone remained alert. And someone probably had to do the work that the sick person normally did. That's expensive. Helping a sick person costs energy, and yet humans repeatedly seem to have invested in people who weren't immediately productive. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it. Why would evolution favor helping someone who isn't currently helping you? Because human life isn't measured in one day. The person lying beside the fire today might be the person who feeds you next year. They might know where water is, they might know which plants are safe, they might know how to make tools, they might be your parent, your child, your partner, your closest friend, or simply someone whose knowledge your group cannot afford to lose. Human cooperation turns survival into a long-term investment, and nowhere is that more visible than in the bones of people who survived terrible injuries. Take Shanidar 1. The skeleton was discovered in Shanidar Cave in Iraq and dates to roughly 45,000 years ago. The individual had severe injuries and physical limitations, including damage to the right side of the body and evidence suggesting major impairment long before death. Yet this person lived for years after those injuries. Someone with significant disabilities had somehow remained part of a community. You don't need to romanticize the evidence. Archaeology can't tell us that everyone hugged this person every morning or that the group was perfectly compassionate. But it can tell you something harder to dismiss. This human survived. And survival required more than personal toughness. It required other humans. Now here's where things get even stranger. Being sick wasn't always obvious. A broken bone is visible. A fever isn't. An infection isn't. A stomach illness isn't. And that means your ancestors had to figure out whether someone was simply tired, temporarily injured, dangerously sick, or about to die. You can imagine the scene. Someone isn't moving. They're breathing differently. They're not eating. They don't respond normally. And the group has no laboratory test that tells them what's happening. No blood panel, no x-ray, no scan, just observation. Human beings are exceptionally good at reading faces, movement, voice, posture, and behavior. You probably do it without thinking. Someone says they're fine, but you can tell they're not. Their voice sounds different. Their eyes look different. They move differently. Their behavior has changed. That ability is ancient, and it may have been enormously useful because caring for a sick person isn't simply about giving them food. It's about deciding whether they need food, water, warmth, isolation, protection, or something else entirely. Of course, ancient humans got many things wrong. They didn't understand bacteria, they didn't know about viruses, they couldn't see parasites multiplying inside the body, and some illnesses were simply unstoppable. That is the part we shouldn't soften. Ancient people died from infections that modern medicine can often treat. A small wound could become dangerous. A severe fever could become deadly. Diarrheal illness could destroy the body's water balance. Respiratory infections could become fatal. And if you were already weak, the danger multiplied. So what did your ancestors actually have? They had observation, they had experience, they had plants, they had heat, they had water, they had food processing, they had rest, and most importantly, they had other people. At Shanidar Cave, Neanderthal remains provide some of the strongest archaeological evidence that severely injured individuals could survive within a social group. And evidence from Neanderthal dental calculus has even revealed traces of plant consumption, including compounds associated with plants such as yarrow and chamomile in some individuals studied by researchers including Karen Hardy and colleagues. That doesn't prove Neanderthals had modern herbal medicine. It doesn't mean they understood chemistry. But it does show something fascinating. Their relationship with plants was more complicated than simply eating whatever happened to be nearby. Some plants were food, some were potentially useful, some may have been selected because they affected the body. And that opens another possibility. Your ancestors didn't just endure nature, they learned from it. But even the best knowledge in the world can't guarantee survival. Sometimes the illness wins. Sometimes the wound becomes infected. Sometimes the fever never breaks. Sometimes the person simply becomes too weak to recover. And this brings us to the darkest part of the story. What happened if the sick person couldn't get better? The answer is that sometimes they died. There is no ancient trick that makes death disappear, but the human response to sickness may have changed something much bigger than medicine. It changed what it meant to be useful. Because if you look at a wolf, a deer, or many other wild animals, survival is strongly tied to physical condition. A severely injured animal may become prey. A sick animal may be left behind. But humans can do something strange. You can become less physically capable and still remain valuable. Your knowledge can outlive your strength, your relationships can outlast your ability to hunt, your memories can remain useful even when your legs don't. And this becomes especially important as humans began living longer. At sites such as Cima de los Huesos in Spain, researchers have found large numbers of Middle Pleistocene human remains dating to around 430,000 years ago, showing just how deep the human story of social life reaches. We cannot reconstruct every caregiving relationship from bones. But we can see a broader pattern. Human beings repeatedly lived in groups where survival depended on cooperation. And eventually, that cooperation became one of our greatest evolutionary advantages. You weren't built to be a perfect hunter, you were built to belong to a group that could compensate when you weren't. That's a very different kind of strength. And it explains something about you right now. When you're sick, you probably don't think about evolution. You think about the headache, the sore throat, the blanket, the glass of water beside your bed. Maybe someone asks, "Do you need anything?" That tiny question is almost absurdly modern in its comfort. But the behavior behind it may be ancient. Someone notices that you're struggling. Someone changes their behavior because of it. Someone gives you something they could have kept for themselves. Someone waits. Someone helps. And suddenly, sickness becomes survivable. Here's the part nobody talks about. Human civilization didn't begin only with tools, fire, or agriculture. It also began with people making room for someone who couldn't keep up. Because the moment a group decides, you can't hunt today so you don't eat, vulnerability becomes a death sentence. But the moment a group decides, you can't hunt today so we'll carry some of the burden, something completely different becomes possible. A human being can survive weakness. A child can survive dependence. An injured hunter can recover. An older person can continue contributing knowledge. A parent can protect a child without simultaneously finding food. And a sick person can have tomorrow. That's enormous. Because every modern hospital, pharmacy, nursing home, emergency room, and medicine cabinet exists inside a much older human instinct. When someone falls down, we look back. When someone is sick, we bring food. When someone can't walk, we carry them. When someone is weak, we don't automatically leave them behind. That isn't the behavior of an animal designed only for individual competition. It's the behavior of a species that became extraordinarily dependent on one another. And maybe that's why sickness tells you something surprisingly beautiful about being human. Your ancestors weren't invincible. They were constantly injured. They were infected. They were exhausted. They were hungry. They lost people. They watched some illnesses win, but they also discovered that survival didn't always require the strongest person to stand up. Sometimes survival meant everyone else sitting beside the person who couldn't. So think back to that ancient human who wakes up unable to hunt. The body hurts. The fire is burning. The group is moving around them. Someone brings water. Someone brings food. Someone watches the children. Someone keeps the fire alive. And for one more day, the sick person doesn't have to prove that they're useful. They just have to survive. That's the remarkable thing. Your ancestors survived sickness not because they had better medicine, but because they gradually became better at caring for one another. They answered hunger with food sharing. They answered cold with fire. They answered injury with cooperation. They answered weakness with protection. And when someone couldn't contribute anything at all, sometimes the group still carried them forward. That changes the way you should think about human evolution. Maybe the story wasn't simply about becoming stronger, maybe it was about becoming the kind of animal where weakness didn't always mean the end. And that's why your quiet little sick day is connected to something unimaginably old. You're lying under a blanket. The room is warm. There's water within reach. You don't have to hunt. You don't have to search for edible roots. You don't have to defend a shelter through the night. You can simply close your eyes and let your body fight. And somewhere deep in that ordinary act is the legacy of millions of years of humans refusing to leave each other behind. You are alive today because, long before medicine existed, someone decided you were worth carrying.